Hello and welcome to the Exeter Impact Podcast, where we host engaging conversations with research experts, sharing their insights, approaches and solutions for advancing impact of research at the University of Exeter and beyond. Our episodes cover diverse flagship research across academic departments and impact types. Tune in every month to learn about planning and embedding research impact and opportunities to develop your impact portfolio. The podcast is developed and hosted by me, Emma Sheriff, an Impact Evidence and Evaluation Officer at the university. Episodes are made available for staff to listen or watch via the Impact Community of Practice SharePoint site and linked in the Exeter Weekly Bulletin. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you very much.
Your research has focused on Islamic legal practice and its theory. Can you tell us more about your work and your research interests?
I was very lucky to have a number of inspirational teachers which set me off on my research interests, particularly in the area of Islamic law. So when we talk about Islamic law, it's normally associated with the term Sharia. What I read, what I research and what I write about now is mainly about how do we come to the rules in the Sharia that we do, and Muslims, how do Muslims reach the rules that they do? What's the theory, if you like? What matters to the process of deriving a rule? What counts as a source? What's an authoritative source? So that's the main work I'm doing at the moment, which is a sort of description of how Muslims in the past and in the present deduce law from sources, and the sources are normally things like the Quran or the actions and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. So that's what I work in, and Muslims have written a lot on this. I mean, it's a very popular form of literature that they've written over the centuries, and that's the area that I work on. And I work on what Sunni Muslims have written about it and what Shi'ite Muslims have written about it. So I cover both of those areas. It's a reasonably obscure and highly theoretical sort of area of work. So it's theoretical, sometimes some would say it's legal philosophy. And so it's something which, to explain it to a lay person, to someone who's not involved in actually the process of law, it sounds like, you know, a really obscure topic. So it's quite specialized. I wouldn't say that my research publications have huge numbers of readers. In at least some of them are very technical, and the aim of them is to sort of move the field along. I do write some things which are more for general interest to try and simplify this process so that a greater number of people can read about it and understand it. But that's the area that I work in mainly, which sort of like most of us that work in the university, our actual specialised area of interest is quite specific and technical and part of a particular field of study in which, you know, we're dealing with the other academics working in this, and those are our prime audience for a lot of what we write. We do try and do things which are more digestible for the general population, but that's the area where we sort of cut our teeth particularly at the beginning of your career.
Why do you think you were particularly drawn to this research in this field?
It was partly teachers who inspired me, as I mentioned, but also, you know, like most academics, when they start off, you've got to have something which you're doing that no one else is doing. Otherwise, you won't have something to attract employers when you're applying for jobs, or everything that we do needs to be something which adds to the sum total of knowledge and research. And I noticed when I was doing my MA, I did my MA at the University of Manchester. So when I was there, I noticed that hardly anyone had written about a particular period of time in this Islamic legal theory. So hardly anyone had written anything about the 18th and early 19th century. No one had done work on it. And so I decided that was where I was going to focus my research. I could have been interested in many different things, but in consultation with my supervisor, this was one of the areas which really interested me and there was a gap. So I felt I would make a contribution if I became the person that sort of like mapped out the thought processes in this period. So it was partly tactical, I suppose you might say. You know, and partly because I felt that there's so much to do in this field. That's another thing which people often don't realise or think. They might think that a lot of this work has already been done, but there's actually thousands of manuscripts and works and theories that have not been explored and have not been explained that Muslim thinkers have developed over the centuries. There's a huge field. So everything you do is new. So you want to choose an area which is novel and is going to make a contribution, is going to fill a gap in the field. And that's part of the reason why I was attracted to it, because I felt that I could really do something new that people hadn't written about before by doing my PhD and then subsequent publications after that.
And no doubt you could see the impact that you could have undertaking that work too. I'm interested in what key findings your research has uncovered. 20 years of research. What do you think that's been?
Yeah, I suppose my main finding, and I'm still working on demonstrating it to the rest of the field, but it's something which I'm working on, and which I suppose I'm in the field. One of the things which I'm known for, if I'm known for anything, in the field of Islamic legal studies, there was always a tendency for the Sunni Muslim version of Islamic legal theory to dominate the field. So Sunni Muslims have formed the majority of Muslims over the centuries, and consequently, when academics write about Islam, they write about Sunni Islam. One of the things which I've really tried to push for is that that's only one version of how Muslim thought developed. That there are alternatives to this sort of dominant narrative. There's alternatives to this, which have been broadly ignored or considered obscure and irrelevant by the field. In particular, the history of Shi'ite Islam, and Shi'ite Islam is a vibrant minority, if you like, but there's between 10 and 20% of Muslims worldwide, so it's a significant minority. And generally speaking, it's been ignored by researchers in the field, and it's only now becoming an important part of what we study and how we understand the world, and the Muslim world in particular. So if I'm known for anything, then I would say that trying to make the study of Islamic law include viewpoints and aspects other than the dominant Sunni Muslim viewpoint. That Shiite Muslims have got a long and interesting and intellectually sophisticated history of legal thought, which has not always been recognised, and that's part of what I try and do in my writings. So the main impact on that is on the field of Islamic legal studies. But I also hope that it spills out in the way in which people talk about Islam in public discourse, so that outside of the academic field, that when people talk about Islam, they don't just talk about the Sunni version of Islam, because those things are often the things which dominate the news agenda, and it's the way in which Islam is talked about in society is quite often exclusively about the Sunni version of the Muslim faith.
Yes.
Whereas Shiite Muslims have, I believe, they have a very important history within the Muslim world more generally. So I think that that's one of the things which I've hoped to change a little bit over the time that I've been working.
Thinking about your impact goals and how you go about embedding impact in your research, how important is that to you? How do you think about embedding impact?
I have to be honest with you. I mean, I suppose I was like a lot of humanities researchers. When we started to talk about the need for our research to impact, and at least to demonstrate the impact of research, I was one which recoiled in horror at the idea that what I was going to be writing had to have some sort of societal benefit or make a contribution to society in one way or another. Because for many of us in the humanities, maybe in other fields as well, part of the reason we became academics is because we were running away from society almost. We were trying to avoid all of the stresses and strains of a regular job. And so the impact agenda was not something which was part of my research interests or involvement for the first 10, 15 years of me working within the field. Up until probably around about 2010, which was when we started to think within the university here and elsewhere as well, wider in the sector, that we started to think about the need for applications for research funding, that research funding from national bodies became a big part of how we were going to fund research activity from now on. We weren't going to be able to do it purely off the benefits of the QR money, the money that we get from the Research Excellence Framework, or other sources. We weren't going to be able to fund the amount of research that we wanted to do and that we felt needed doing in the field unless we managed to get research funding. And impact was woven into those applications. So I was a sort of, I needed to be prompted in order to start thinking about the way in which my research might have impact. And part of the prompts for that was that I wanted to do what you might call pure research without thinking about the impact. But the funding availability for those was very, very limited. So you felt you needed to get funding, and then you had to work impact into it. And I found that actually I quite enjoyed it. I actually enjoyed the process of making some of the more obscure bits of my own research useful to people outside of academia. So I was not kicking and screaming, but it was a bit of a rude awakening for me to realize that, that I had to build that into any application I might have for funds. And that's how I started off, trying to link what I do in my research with a societal need or something that might be useful for people outside of academia or partnerships with people outside of academia. It came from the sort of like the prompt from funding agencies saying this was now an important part of what you're going to do if you have a research project with us. So that's how I came to it. But it was I found the first project I had, which was a joint AHRC and ESRC project, which had a very strong impact agenda as part of it, really prompted me to get involved in impact activities. And it's sort of grown from there as I found them increasingly satisfying and enjoyable, and that they've changed the way in which I do research as well. So they fed back, I've learned a lot from those interactions, which has enabled me to change the way in which I do research.
So moving on to think about the research that you've led in your field, I'm interested to know whether you identify specific impact goals at the outset of your research, or whether during that process sort of they emerge or change. What does that look like to you?
The best way to answer this is probably through an example of the way in which it happened. So that first project which I mentioned, I'd been working on how have Muslim thinkers in the past justified violence, or what we might call a violent act. How they justify that? What are the sources that they use to justify that? Scriptural sources or other sources that they might use. And when do they delegitimize violence? When do they decide that violence isn't justified and you're not allowed to act violently? So I've been researching that for quite a long time, and I wanted to sort of build up a body, a network, if you like, of academics who work in a similar area across different traditions within the Muslim world. And that's why that project was one which I really wanted to have. And I had to have an impact element of it. So a lot of the things that we did in terms of the research was quite technical and historical. But it was very clear that it had real implications for the world, because of post 9/11 awareness, if you like, of acts of violence by groups that claim to be Muslim was high on the agenda in terms of the international news cycle, as well as in the consciousness of the population. So we had to try and work out ways in which this body of research that we built up about how acts of violence are justified or not justified by Muslim thinkers in their literature, according to their theories, if you like, how that was was that of any use to society as a whole? And we found out that there was a huge need to try and understand why some Muslims get involved in acts of violence and why some Muslims do not get and refuse to get involved in acts of violence. This was a very important body of findings, if you like, of the theoretical side of why Muslims might get involved in acts of violence and why they might avoid them or refuse to get involved in them. So you found that there were people outside of academia who desperately needed crash courses, if you like, on the sort of theoretical background to why Muslims think this way, or why some Muslims think this way and other Muslims think that way. So you found that so in the Home Office, for example, when they're trying to understand and look at social cohesion, they want to understand what prevents Muslims from being involved in community projects or in government more generally, and why do we sometimes have Muslims who turn away from all of that and get involved in, what the government likes to call extremist groups. So why does that happen? What are the theoretical things which are going on which cause that to happen? So the Home Office, we did work with the Home Office in terms of social cohesion to try and understand what was going on there. And then there was quite a lot of work in terms of the Foreign Office as well, because they needed to be able to understand what the relationship was between movements and actions which were going on in the Muslim world and elsewhere in the world, and what that impact might have on the British context. So the Foreign Office were also interested in how that might work. So we contributed also to their, if you like, their policy discussions. And then perhaps one of the largest areas of work that I've been involved in is with the legal profession. Because in the wake of 9/11, a whole series of regulations and laws have come in the UK, which declare particular types of activity illegal, such as the ownership and dissemination of material which is deemed to be helpful to a terrorist organisation. So we did find that when someone was arrested for that crime, they quite often had lots of material. And the investigating authorities, the police, and then the Crown Prosecution Services, they really didn't have very much of a clue. They didn't know the intellectual background of any of this material. They didn't understand this material. So they needed academic experts to be able to tell them what the material is, where it comes from, what's its message. Is it an unusual message? And so we got quite a lot of engagement through that. And then there was people who had been charged with these offences, and the defence team also wanted to be able to understand all the material. So you get work. You ended up being expert advisors to both the prosecution and the defence teams in terms of their work, because there was this material out there which people just didn't understand. But of course, it was the sort of material that we've been working with on a day-to-day basis for our research work. So making those connections was something which came out of that project, which was called Legitimate and Illegitimate Violence in Islamic Thought. We called the Live It project for short. And that was the beginning, if you like, of a really serious engagement with people outside of the academic field and trying to get our research to feed in, if you like, so that the Home Office can develop more sensitive and effective policy. Similarly with the Foreign Office, but also when we worked with the legal, professions, we were able to demonstrate that the legal process runs smoother when you have experts advising prosecution and defence teams about the material that they've got in their hand. Otherwise, no one really understands what the material that the person had in their possession, what it really is, before they can make a decision as to whether or not the person's guilty or not. They need to know what the material is, and a lot of it's literature which they've collected, literature which is, well known to us as researchers, but completely unknown outside of the academic world, but very important for the individuals who are accused of the crime. So those are the sorts of so the pathway was really that we were forced to think about how our research might feed into policy and practice and professional practice because of a grant application. But when we actually got into the work, when the team of us who were working on the Live It project got into the work, we suddenly realized this is actually very satisfying, and you can really see the effect of your research in a way which you never thought it was going to materialize. You learn a lot about your own research processes when you have to explain your material to someone who's not an expert. And that's a very useful process, which going to academic conferences doesn't always prepare you for.
No.
Because an academic conference is you talking to other people, and you can start midway through the conversation. When you're working with the police or with the CPS or with defence teams or whatever, you really, they're not trained in any of this information. Trained with any of this information. They know a little bit, but they really want to know how it all fits together, and that's our job, if you like. That was our job during both the Live It project and a follow-on project, which I also got funding from the AHRC and ESRC for that. So that's that's a long answer to a short question, but it's that's the way in which we ended up doing the way in which the work that we did in terms of working with non-academic bodies, both governmental bodies, not-for-profit organisations, and the legal sphere.
Thank you. So you've talked a little about the stakeholders that you worked with. I wonder what process you go about identifying the stakeholders who are perhaps individuals who you want to gain their perspectives, have an impact on them, that are beyond the police, government organisations, not-for-profit. So how do you work with your stakeholders that you hope would benefit from the outcomes of the research?
Identifying them is a bit haphazard, to be honest with you. You in your conversations with your stakeholder, with your partner, when they first come to it, so they essentially, with some of the legal work, they came to us and asked. Well, one thing which I will say is that most of these are particularly publicly funded bodies. If you offer free training event, they'll jump at it because they normally have to pay a lot of money for their training. But if you're going to offer it as an academic, you're going to offer a free training event or put together a group of people who are working on their impact. They're going to do a training event for the police. Then they will jump at the chance of that because they find it difficult to find people who are appropriate, and they know that there's a real need. So conversations with partners and people who we were working with on a particular case about what generally is needed in your sector. What are the ways in which we could help within the sector? What do you think is required has led us to be a bit more proactive rather than reactive in terms of our impact. And saying, okay, So, we did seminars in London, for example, with law firms who work primarily with defence. So they're defending people accused of terrorism offences, and they need to know quite a bit of basic information, because these people who work in the law, they've got Islam-related terrorism offence one week, and then they've got a armed robbery the next, and then they've got something else, a tax issue, prosecution around tax the next. So they move from one topic to another topic to another topic. They don't specialise in it like we do. So they want to really get a quick injection of ideas, such that for the next time a case like this comes along, they will be able to tackle it in a more effective way. So that was the way in which we started to be a little bit more proactive, and we did that with the police, and we did that with legal professions, and we organised some which were practitioners who would be useful. From our perspective, would be useful research contacts, because they had access to material that sometimes we didn't have access to, or that had come up that we didn't know about. So we found it sort of like an iterative process, whereby our impact work fed back material which sometimes we didn't know existed, or we didn't know that it was deemed important, and that enabled us to reformulate some of our research questions, and produce the academic side of the projects, which was necessary for research funding, but at the same time be able to credit our partnerships with changing the way in which we did the research, as well as benefiting the partners in terms of their skill level. So those were the sort of ways in which we operated, and to an extent I continue to operate now that the projects are finished. We're not working as a team so much anymore, but since then my ongoing impact work is involved in attempting to continue to raise the skill level within these different non-academic sectors, such that they make well-informed decisions. When they're making policy, or when they're dealing with a legal case, they make well-informed decisions, and that's what we aim to do in the projects, and what my ongoing impact work aims to do as well.
I'm interested to know what your reflections are on the impact pathways that you've used, and how successful they were, or which you wouldn't use again.
Well, not everything works. Not everything works, and you've got to try out a lot of different potential impact mechanisms, I think, to find out, first of all, what you're good at, but also what's most effective with the people you're going to work with. So, for example, we found that some of the training events that we held with professional organisations, they turned into sort of like mini lecture series that we might give to our undergraduates, because I think that's what they felt they needed. And for some of the people that are working in the professional organisations, they wanted to be educated. They wanted to go, they wanted to go back to university if they'd been to university. They wanted to go back to university and just have that chance to be outside of their day-to-day work and just have people lecture them for a morning. That wasn't the point of the exercise. We wanted to be able to have a much more engaging way in which we interact with them, such that we can be really useful and they can take those lessons out of the training event into their professional lives. And we found that quite a lot of them, for one reason or other, they saw this as an opportunity to really explore, to really, have a little bit of a seminar and be a student again. And I'm not convinced that that was what was needed at all in terms of gauging the impact. So you have some things which you think are going to come be like this, and they turn out to be like that. And so what you do is you feed that into the next time you do something, and you think to yourself, I'm going to plan it differently. We're not just going to have presentations with question and answer afterwards. We're going to have something different in terms of discussion points, and that is actually how we got better at doing it over the time, is by trial and error. And it worked fine in the end, but it was a long process of trial and error before we worked out what it was that was going to work in this particular context for our particular partners.
And so drawing that to a close, I suppose, how did the impact, do you think, benefit your stakeholders? So what was the take home?
Well, I'm hoping that that there are some people that work in the Home Office that take on board elements of the Muslim community's experience and its history, which they weren't taking on board before. Sometimes it's very difficult to actually identify the precise impact immediately from what you've done. And that may be a long-term trickle, if you like. So I'm hoping that has happened. And sometimes you can see it, that it has happened in particular. Ways in which words are used in particular policy documents. And, it's not just myself, but one of the things we've noticed is that the use of a term like Islamophobia has moved from the fringes into the political mainstream. And part of the reason for that may well be because academics, for whom Islamophobia was a recognized recognized academic term, have managed to introduce that outside, if you like, of the academic context and make it start being used, and that as a societal problem tackled because it's been named. So that is one part of an effect, if you like, that we may have contributed to that process. But it's very difficult to pinpoint particular things. On a more sort of concrete level, that you can actually point to and say, that's different because I was involved. You can say that, particularly in individual legal cases. You can say that this court process was, I think, better for my involvement than it would have been if I'd not been involved. Because the prosecution didn't know what the material was, the defence didn't know what the material was, and so the defendant could have been completely misunderstood without my input as to what the material was that they held in their possession and what it meant and what its position was, if you like, in the broader history of Islamic thought. That defendant might not have got the same experience, and the court generally might have not been successful. We actually could quantify the amount of court time that some of our expert witness submissions saved, because there was going to be a sort of a 2-day discussion about what this document meant and where it was by in a group in a setting where no one really knew what it meant or what it was. So non-experts speaking with non-experts are going to argue about this for 2 days. Asking an expert witness to come in and explain it all cut out those 2 days of court time. So we actually you'd almost put a figure on it, how much money we'd saved by our involvement, which of course is, for the funding bodies, that is a concrete number. And that's another thing to think about when you are working with in terms of impact activities. Think about how you can come out at the end with concrete numbers, to just be completely crude about this. Think about things which you can demonstrate, it was going to cost this much and now it's costing that much. before we got involved, so many people were going to be benefiting. Now it's twice that number. So if you can tie it down to those things and build your impact activities such that you can quantify that at the end of it, it makes it so much easier to be able to demonstrate, if you like, that your research is really making a difference.
So I'm going to ask you one final question, which I'll be asking to all our guests, which is what single piece of advice you can offer to individual researchers to act on to ensure research impact is achieved in their work?
Start the conversations early in the process. Don't treat it as an afterthought of the research process. Treat it as part of the development of your research questions and your research planning. It doesn't have to dominate, but you have to start it early, because otherwise you will produce if you put this purely in commercial terms, you will produce a product which no one wants to buy. But if you start the process of exchange and conversation early, you will end up with something, hopefully, which can make a difference.
Thank you, Rob, for your participation today, and thank you to our listeners. Exeter staff can access the details of impact workshops and resources from the Impact Evidence and Evaluation team via the episode links. You can also contact us for support to plan your impact in readiness for a REF impact case study.